Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time we completed Misery Mire, and unlike the Ice Palace, I discovered a newfound appreciation for that dungeon. This time, no such thing is needed. We've reached the penultimate dungeon of A Link to the Past, the excellent Turtle Rock. So, it's back up to Death Mountain we go. And joining me today to take you through this great dungeon is my friend Pixel Fusion.
Man, I love this dungeon. Hey Daniel, thanks for letting me join you on this episode of your show. I'm Pixel Fusion and a friend of the captain here. He's shown up a few times on my channel. Anyhow, Turtle Rock is an awesome dungeon. The environment, difficulty, and unique mechanics of it always stuck out to me. Plus, a few hidden goodies you can get with careful use of the mirror out on the cliff face. A Link to the Past is probably my favorite Zelda game, and definitely the one I grew up with as a kid. I spent way too many nights hanging out with my best friend playing this game until dawn.
Gaining access to the dungeon isn't too difficult. Like the entrance to Misery Mire, the required medallion is marked by a crest at the dungeon entrance. This time, we need Quake, which can actually be obtained much earlier on in the game, but is only required now. You're also going to want to get yourself the Ice Rod, if you haven't already for some reason. And if you're doing dungeons out of order, you will want to have gotten the Cane of Sumaria from Misery Mire and Fire Rod from Skull Woods before even thinking about tackling this place. Worth a mention as well, while you can pretty well cross over this section of Death Mountain right away and go straight to the top, there's a fair amount of goodies to get around the Death Mountain area in both worlds. So I usually recommend giving these caves a thorough sweep while you're here. None of that is required per se, but I do find combing through all these caves pretty fun, and the goodies you can get here are pretty nice, so it's worthwhile if you ask me, just not mandatory.
If you don't mind me throwing in a little extra regarding the mountain here, it looks awesome. The music is intense. It's also the only spot in the game where you encounter Lynels, who look really cool in this game compared to their Zelda 1 counterparts. Basically, all of the graphics in this game, the sprite work and classic pixel art are a real joy to look at, be it from the subtle lighting when you enter a dungeon at the door, to the landscape you can see from the mountain in the light world. Its appearance in the dark world though, with this pulsing light, it's fantastic.
A bit of maneuvering between the game's two worlds will be needed here, as you can only get up to this ledge to open the dungeon by warping in from the light world, just like with the last two dungeons. It's a small touch, but I appreciate that the game makes use of its dual world system so nicely. Alright, once we've used the Quake medallion up here, the entrance will be revealed, and we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to Turtle Rock, the location of the final crystal and the penultimate dungeon of A Link to the Past. You can probably guess why this dungeon is named Turtle Rock, because this rock is it's a turtle. This guy is a bit like a turtle too, like a rocky turtle guy. Aside from that, the name has little bearing on anything else going on here, but it is pretty memorable. More memorable than just naming it whatever temple. Aesthetically, this dungeon isn't anything to write home about. It uses the same tile sets that a lot of the various caves that we've explored in both Hyrule and the Dark World alike do. It isn't a bad look per se, and this dungeon does have a lot of standout and memorable set pieces and mechanics, but you'll have to look past the same brown rocky walls that we've seen already.
Well, there is that section with the lava and the pipes. Those are tile assets I don't think that are used anywhere else in the game. You are right though, that in some aspects, it looks more like an expansive cave. Those I-beam things on the wall return, and have always creeped me out. You gotta love that sound effect though.
None of this is to say that Turtle Rock is bad. I would have liked for it to be more visually distinct, yes, but in terms of gameplay, this is an excellent dungeon. Interestingly, Turtle Rock actually shares a lot of similarities in terms of structure to the Shadow Temple in Ocarina of Time. That 3-act structure? Check. Moving platforms over bottomless death pits? Also check. Spike floors, stalfos, a dramatic ride leading up towards the boss chambers? Check, check, check. It's not like the Shadow Temple is a one-to-one copy of this place though. Obviously those aforementioned aesthetics are not even close to being the same, but I can't help but wonder if some creative inspiration for the level design of that dungeon was rooted here.
You could be onto something there, Daniel. There were a lot of creators who share work between the two games. And while Aonuma was brought in as a dungeon designer for Ocarina, he may have drawn a lot of inspiration from this game. Clearly, the dungeon formula expanded there, and as we all know, would become a staple until Breath of the Wild came around. Still, I miss the 2D games like this. I hope we get more of them in the future.
A Link to the Past really has done a wonderful job of balancing its dungeons between linear gauntlet-style dungeons and large, open, central room-based exploratory dungeons. And that delicate balance is a good thing. What I find impressive about Turtle Rock is that it really manages to blend those two styles together nicely via that 3-act structure I mentioned before. Rather than leaning all the way into one or the other, this dungeon can be neatly sliced into 3 distinct acts that each, when played together as one dungeon, act like a linear sequence. You have to start in this area, complete these tasks, then move on to the next area, complete objectives there, and so forth. However, when we examine those 3 areas individually, they could each be seen as open exploratory dungeons in their own right. This is the central room for this chunk of the dungeon, and this is the central room for the next chunk of the dungeon. If this is confusing, think of it this way. Misery Mire is one of those open exploratory dungeons with an important central room. Now imagine if after completing all of this dungeon, rather than reaching the boss room, you went downstairs and there was just another dungeon with its own central room, and you got to explore again. That's what it feels like we get here. Granted, these sections individually are all much shorter than Misery Mire was, but in terms of structure, it fits, even if only loosely, and when all 3 sections are combined, the length of the dungeon is appropriate. There's a fair amount of that backtracking and crisscrossing within each section as you explore, but you likely won't have to backtrack to a previous section. But let's rewind for a minute and start at the beginning. The dungeon foyer will start us down this hallway and into the first floor's central room. We won't be able to even reach this central room until we figure out, with some experimentation, that we can create moving platforms with the Cane of Sumaria. From the central room, we have 5 doors ahead of us, with one of them being locked. This kicks off what is essentially our first objective here, finding the key so that we can make progress further through the dungeon. We'll also find the map and compass around here.
I gotta say, I really like the use of the Cane of Sumaria here. Fundamentally, it just makes blocks that you can push around, which really isn't useful outside of that one room in the ice dungeon. You can also turn it into a set of projectiles by hitting it again, but that isn't very useful and you may as well just use the fire rod then. The choice to include its use of making platforms is pretty neat though, and also does a good job of consuming your magic if you spend too much time going back and forth between the rooms. Always bring some green potion with you, or maybe even a blue one if you can afford it.
Green potion is definitely helpful, as even though there are magic drops around here, they don't respawn unless you leave the dungeon entirely. So if you're exploring thoroughly and looking for that aforementioned key, you may accidentally grab these before you need them and end up running short on magic power. That key we need is tucked here in the northeast corner of the dungeon, requiring us to solve this time-based torch lighting puzzle, all while riding this platform, followed by some spike traps. Once we've nabbed that, we can cross back through the central room and pass through that locked door and towards the dungeon's second act.
Don't forget about that last room with the chain jumps. They're adorable. Also, kind of strange to see in a Zelda game. But these early titles had a few instances of Mario enemies in them. Manhandla from Zelda 1 for instance, the chain chomps here, and of course in the next game, Link's Awakening. There were more than a few obvious ones around. Anyhow, these guys are cute. I wish I could break their chains.
This does make me wonder, between the chain chomps, the fire bars, the hokuboku, along with the generally more cave-like architecture here, if this was one of the earlier dungeons that they designed for the game, and if they were at the time borrowing a lot of assets or at least ideas from the Mario series. It's a curious thought, but Zelda games tend to throw some of those earlier developed dungeons in closer to the end of the game for some reason. Still, that's speculation on my part. Moving on, we can head down to Basement 1.
Ah yes, this next part is fun. And there are these cool lava tubes that you have to travel through. And while I think their layout is a bit nonsensical, it's fun to watch the camera track your movements through them. If this were a 3D game, you might easily get lost being stuck in a first-person perspective mode. But in the 2D world, we instead get this cool sliding effect. Also, it reminds me of some levels in Mario 3, where you end up moving through large jumbles of pipes. I'll stop bringing up Mario now.
Navigating these tubes offers a neat effect. They're the perfect example of the layout feeling winding and twisting while being not too difficult to navigate. They limit how many tubes you actually have access to at any one given time, and they each have a defined entrance and exit. So what ends up happening is that the layout looks and feels confusing, but we're ushered to the correct area fairly automatically. It's a bit cheeky on the developer's part, but making your way through this area genuinely makes me feel smart for having gotten through it, even though I was just along for the ride. Our objective here is getting the dungeon item, found in this room at the southernmost end of the dungeon. But to get it, we'll need to get that big key at the center of this tangled mess of tubes. With that in hand, the dungeon actually tricks us a little, forcing us outside in order to actually reach that spot with the big chest.
I mentioned that there are sections outside on the cliff you can use the mirror to return to the light world. I always love it when sections of a dungeon return to the overworld. Doing so can get you a piece of heart and a magic refill just in case you need it.
With the mirror shield in hand, it's just a matter of navigating to the next staircase and heading into the dungeon's third section. As has been pretty well the case with most dungeons in this game, the next area is a bit less exploratory and a bit more linear, which is totally okay. The challenges here feel a little less about navigation and more about testing your mettle and making use of our new item. If you missed that mirror shield and somehow made your way down here, then you probably won't get far with all of these laser eyes shooting at you. We get another section that makes use of the Cane of Sumaria, a minor detour for a small key in which we need to orient Link appropriately to block these lasers, and then a room that is essentially one massive gem switch puzzle. Gosh, I love this mechanic. All of this culminates in this rather dramatic ride over the abyss and towards the dungeon's finale. I know this is only a small moment, but there's something about this ride through this room that always stuck with me. It's brief, but it rightly feels like it's building up towards something big. Atmosphere is such a big part of the dungeon experience, and it's on full display right here. With all of that said, once we've crossed this abyss, we can confront the dungeon boss. Entering the arena will come face to face with Trinix. And man, this is one of my favorite bosses in the game. Trinix has a great visual design. He's large and imposing and has this three-headed thing going on. And his rocky carapace dino turtle thing is frankly unlike anything we've seen in Zelda bosses since. It's almost too bad that we've never gotten a reimagining of this guy, despite so many other 2D bosses becoming staples in the series going forward. If we can get 50 iterations of Goma, where is our 3D version of Trinex? In terms of combat, Trinex works as a bit of a type matchup style boss. One head shoots fire, and the other one shoots ice, and since we've come equipped with both our own fire and ice rods, we have to use those opposing elements to stun him and deal damage. It's unfortunate that the mirror shield doesn't really come into play here, but I'm completely willing to overlook that for just how fun the boss is on its own.
I find it interesting that you need magic to fight this boss, and if you happen to run out, well, it's game over. This boss is also the first Zelda boss to integrate fire and ice themes, something that would show up again in later games. It's a cool fight. It reminds me of Gleeok back in the day, but mainly because of its multi-headed aspect. Once you manage to take out the 2 elemental heads, the shell breaks off, leading to round 2.
The second phase here will have him go into what I call snake mode. His behavior here is pretty similar to the likes of Moldorm, but his weak point isn't his head or tail. You've got to aim instead for his midsection, making it much more difficult to keep your distance. You've got to engage far more closely and get into riskier positions in order to land a strike on him successfully. This part isn't the most challenging, but it still holds its appeal. If this were the entire battle, I think it would be a straight up fail from me, but this being only one of 2 parts makes it far more acceptable to me to have it be this straightforward. We already had to problem solve in phase 1, so phase 2 can be more about reflex. It works, and as I mentioned before, this truly is one of the best bosses in the game.
This seems like a good time to bring something up. The boss is immune to arrows in both phases, which was possibly done to prevent it from dying from a single silver arrow. You could have those at this point, and as far as I can tell, they will one-shot all monsters except for Ganon, from the beefy Hinoxes to Lynels and even other bosses. I once did a run where I got the dungeon items from the Dark World, but left the bosses intact except for levels 5 and 6, as those are the ones who trigger unlocking the big bomb. Once I had silver arrows, I went back and tested it on the bosses. And if they could be hurt by arrows, they would always die in one shot. Sure, you might have to break off a mask with the hammer first, but the arrow itself would slay them when it hit their weak point. Since Trinex is immune to arrows though, you'll have to take him out with your sword as intended.
Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container, as usual. The final maiden, Zelda herself will be freed, and all we have left to do now is head towards Ganon's tower. So that's the dungeon. Overall, Turtle Rock is an excellent dungeon. It has a great sense of delving deeper and deeper into the dungeon depths, with that boss chamber being far removed from the entrance, unlike many other dungeons which place it near the central room, and therefore not too far from the entrance. Here, that journey to the boss room is a trek, and it makes it feel more dangerous because of how much we have to endure just to get there. Structurally, we have several well-crafted exploratory sections that make up the components in a larger linear dungeon, and then it manages to cap it all off with one of the game's best boss battles. I adore Trinex. He's a genuine pleasure to take down. I really don't have a lot of complaints here. I suppose I would have liked to see more use for the mirror shield, but even then, that complaint feels like I'm stretching it, as it successfully makes obstacles that could give you serious trouble earlier in the dungeon much easier to overcome. The only opportunity to use it more would perhaps have been if it was used during that boss fight. Even then though, that concept of deflecting elemental attacks would come to fruition in later games. But with the way A Link to the Past's items and controls are set up, I can't see that type of battle working particularly well here. So even though it would have been cool, I don't really think it is enough for me to dock points here.
I wouldn't be surprised to find out that they intended a deflection mechanic with the boss, similar to what we see in Ocarina of Time versus Kotake and Kome. The series' history has always been plagued with limitations of the system, and that of course has always hampered the vision of the creators. Trinex stands out to me simply because you need magic, the Fire Rod and the hidden overworld Ice Rod to defeat them. Usually you just need the dungeon item, either that dungeon's one or a past one, and of course your sword. This really makes me wonder if they did intend for breath deflection mechanics.
I was also going to complain initially that since this dungeon makes such good use of the Cane of Sumeria, that it does highlight some missed potential in Misery Mire. Perhaps a rework could have made it so that it was placed as the dungeon item here. We could have 2 items even, why not? The Spirit Temple does it, but again, some serious reworking would need to be done since you need that cane as early as the first room here. So really, this is a shortcoming of the prior dungeon not using its own item as effectively as it could have, rather than anything wrong with Turtle Rock itself.
Perhaps they could have included this spot in Misery Mire in order to demonstrate how the rod could create platforms. It's a little odd that one of its core functions is missing from the dungeon it was introduced in. I'd argue that its most useful function is actually found in the dungeon before you get it.
The only thing I would say that leaves something to be desired is the architecture. As mentioned before, these cave walls are the same tiles used in regular caves, meaning that there isn't a lot aside from the dungeon mechanics that sets this place apart visually. But that gets so quickly overshadowed by how much other great stuff is going on here. So overall, Turtle Rock, well, rocks? It rocks? I'm sorry, that was my bad. I couldn't resist. Dad jokes aside, it is genuinely a great dungeon though.
It's one of my favorites. I like the Tower of Ganon too, but it's kind of a rehash of everything from the game. I look forward to your video on it.
And hey, before we sign off, I would like to take a moment to thank Pixel Fusion for joining me on this video. It's always a pleasure to chat with a fellow enjoyer of A Link to the Past. You'll find links in the description to his channel so you can head on over that way and catch some more great Zelda content.
Oh, of course, Daniel. Thank you for having me. I really do love this game. And unlike those early 3D graphics, pristine pixel art always holds up well. Visually, every aspect of this game was crafted with care, love, and attention to detail. Truly a marvel that continues to stand the test of time. If your fans happen to be interested in what I'm doing over on my channel, lately I've been creating List of Mysteries and Tears of the Kingdom, and trying to make sense of things that don't quite add up. There is a lot, I don't need to tell you that. All the same, I hope you all have a good day, be safe, and may the way of the hero lead to the Triforce.
Thank you all so much for watching, and an extra big thanks goes to my supporters across both Patreon and here on YouTube as a channel member. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny, as well as so many more people, the names of which you're seeing on screen here. Thank you all so much for all of the support. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.